All right, so welcome everybody. Today we're going to be going over JavaScript because that's what we're going to be using in this class. As you said, no PHP or other kind of frameworks, so we'll be using JavaScript almost exclusively except for the HTML and CSS parts. So we're going to go over the loops, conditional statements, functions, variables, and parameters. And then along with we're going to touch on arrays. So loops first. I also tried to include references to the W3 schools down below and any other sites that I reference. They are live links, so I can post this presentation as well in our group chat or in a group wherever we decide to post it. But all right, so for loops, if you're familiar with those are just going to be, it's going to loop through a block of code that you're going to execute so many times, and you can control how many times, you can control how often, you can control the block of code. So there's just going to, in general, it's just going to be just blocking or looping through that. A for in is a more specific type of loop, and it's usually used in arrays, which we'll get to later. But it's going to be, you're looping through a specific thing in an object or in an array. So while loops, those are used for looping. Yeah, again, looping through the condition. But the while and the do while loops are, you got to be careful because if you're not careful, well, any loops actually, you got to be careful because this is going to be what breaks your machine or breaks your browser, because you can have an infinite loop that will go through. So we'll kind of go through those here. So let's go through some pseudocode. Well, I guess any questions so far?
Nope.
All right, so you got some pseudocode for a for and a for in loop. It's going to follow the same thing here, but you have the for and then whatever boundary that you have that's going to set your loop, and then the sequence, which is the code that's going to run, and then the end for. So in JavaScript, it's going to look something like this. And this is a very common one where you have for, and then you use a variable I, and you're going to say I equals 0 or I equals whatever, and then the middle one where it says I is less than 5, that's the condition that is going to keep it going. It's going to check that every loop to see, is this still true? Oh, it is true. Okay, run through the loop again. And then it's going to check, and then the last statement, the I++, that's what's going to happen after the loop is done. So for an example, the first time this loop goes through, it's going to say I equals 0 because you're initializing the I, and then it's going to say, is I less than 5? It is. Okay, so it's going to go into the loop, and it's going to say, it's going to grab text, and it's going to plus and add on the number is, and then in this case 0 because I is equal to 0, and then it will come back to the loop again and say, I finished, so I'm going to add 1 to I. So now I is equal to 1. And then it's going to check the condition statement, and it's going to say, is I less than 5? Oh, it is? Okay. And it's going to run through the loop again. And it's going to keep doing that until I eventually is equal to 5, and which in case I is not then less than 5, and so it will break out the loop. So sorry, that was a lot, but there's, again, stop me if you have any questions, but that's a for loop.
It's a great explanation. I like it. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, the for in loop is a little bit more complicated, and I don't know, I didn't include code for that, but it's going to be something similar to, like, let's say you have a list of passengers in an airplane in an object called manifest, and all that's in there is passengers. So you could say it would be a loop that would look something like for, and then inside it would be passengers in manifest. And it would just, and then you could use, instead of I, you're using, every time you loop through, you would have the passengers object that you could pass around. But anyway, yeah, it's a little bit more. Again, you can look at the link in the last page, and that'll kind of go into more loop or more examples of that. So this while condition, it's slightly different because just the way that it's structured. And so the condition of while is going to be at the very beginning, and it's just that's what it's going to check. It's going to check, is this still true? Is this still true? Is this still true? And then every time it is true, it's going to execute the sequence or the code inside. So here we have the JavaScript while. And so what's dangerous about this is if you go into, like, let's say in here I have I is less than 10, and then it says the text. Let's say I starts out at 0, right? So the first time it goes through, it says, oh yeah, 0 is less than 10. And so the next line, it says I plus plus. So you're adding 1 to I. Okay, so next time it's 1, and then the next time it goes through, it's 2. Well, if you forget that I plus plus, well, guess what? I is equal to 0, and it's going to keep being equal to 0. So the next thing you know, you look at your RAM on your computer, and it's spiked, and your browser's frozen, and you're wondering what just happened. Well, that's what just happened. While loops are notorious for stuff like that. So because in a for loop, it's just kind of good practice to always have that increment, the I plus plus, or even the I minus minus, or whatever in that, where the while loop is more loose. And so yeah, it's just a little bit more dangerous. The do while loop is a little bit different than the while loop, because the while loop might not run. Let's say if I is equal to 11 and it hits the while loop, it actually won't run any of the code. But a do while loop will actually do the code in the brackets at least once. So it'll run through the code and say, all right, text plus equals the number is, and then whatever I is equal to, and then it increments I, and then it will check the while statement. So it's actually going to do that code at least once. That's the big difference between the while and the while loop, or the while and the do while. And you would think, well, why would you need both of those? But it's just one of those things. It's nice to have in your toolkit. So if it comes up and you're like, oh, this would be a case where I could use the do while loop. But other than that, usually the for loops are very commonly used. And then again, the while, I've seen a lot of whiles, but do whiles are, again, just something to know, good to know.
So can you consider while loop as an if statement?
The inside, you mean you want to combine the if statement, or?
No, for example, can you use while loop instead of if statement, like a single if?
Oh, you could, except for you have to be careful, because if you're not changing what it's checking, then it would be an infinite loop.
Mm-hmm.
So let's say you want to check that if passenger is sitting in row 2, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, that passenger isn't going to move anywhere. He's not being moved unless your code moves him. So while the passenger is in row 2, do this. Oh, he is in row 2. I'm going to do it. Oh, he is in row 2. I'm going to do it. Oh, he is in row 2. And so it would get stuck. So you could, but usually an if statement is something you're going to want to do once, and usually only once.
So seems like while loops, it's a useless loop, right?
It could be some. Let's say you wanted to give a refund to all your passengers in your manifest, and you say, well, you know that if the customer cost is over the 250 mark, well, give them a discount or something like that. And so you could use a while loop to loop through the manifest, and I guess that would probably be more for loop. But I'm trying to think of a good example of a while.
Oh, I'm just curious. I just never use while loop. I usually use for loop, or do while. I mean, but while it seems like.
Yeah, and again, it's one of those special cases. And even do while, I think, is even a special case. Like, you can figure out how to do that with a for loop or with other cases. So yeah, it's gonna depend. And again, they're actually kind of dangerous, so or they can be dangerous. So I see your point. Like, I totally agree with you. Yeah.
Mind if I give an example for while?
Yeah, absolutely.
Typically, I use whiles if you just have like a bool statement. So it's like a true or false. So if you're waiting for something to happen, like you're like while the user is on this page, keep playing this animation or something like that. So then once they leave, then that'll stop. So typically, while
that's a good one.
Yeah, good example.
Yeah, so the other one that we use is and you shouldn't do this all the time, but timeouts. If you have a timeout and you just check while some condition is true, like you said, they're on a page, and then you have a timeout counter that's counting every second or something like that, or every half a second, and then it could do something while they're there for the first 10 seconds. I think we've used that before.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, good questions. Good. Thank you. All right. So the next is conditional statements, and these are the ifs and the if, the else, and the else if. These are pretty good. I mean, while loops are loop, but code is usually linear. So this is used often to have conditional statements in linear things. And then the last thing I did dedicate its own page to is the switch. So you can see the two references there for the if and the switch. And so here we have our pseudo if. And this is just the basic, if a condition is true, then do this code. In this example here, you have the time, you're going to get the hours and using the 24-hour military time. And if the time is less than 20, then hey, your greeting is good day. Other, and that's it. That's if you wanted. And so it's really powerful. It's used commonly, but then it also is used in connection with the else if. So this is if you want something to run, you can either use an if or an else if. And the reason to use an else if over just lots of ifs is performance. Sometimes if you only want one condition and only one condition to be checked, so you know that, like going back to the passenger manifest, the passenger is sitting in row 2 or row 3 or row 4, but he's only going to ever sit in one row. Then that would be a good example. You could use an if, else if. Here they have the get hours where it's either going to be less than 10 or greater than 20. So you can have a good morning or a good day. Or I'm sorry, less than 10 or less than 20. But in this case, an example of 15, it's going to hit that first if and say, oh, that's false. But then the next else if is going to be true, and then it will break out. So you can actually chain these together with several else ifs. So you could actually check by hour if you wanted to, or whatever you wanted to. So, and then the else is kind of a catch. If nothing else above any of the block, the if chain block is true, then the else will run. So in this case, you can check if the time is less than 20, and if it's not, then do this. So it's yeah. Any questions on that? That one's all right. Cool. And then we have the switch statement. So the switch statement is you pass in an expression or a condition, and then it checks it against all the cases. So in this example, you're going to pass in fruits, and if the fruit is equal to the string banana, then text is then equal to banana is good, or orange. And then in this case, we don't use an else as a catch-all. We use a default if we want to catch and say, well, if nothing matches, if it doesn't match any of those cases, you can do this. So the other thing that's important in these is to use the break keyword inside the case, because that'll get you out of the switch loop. Otherwise, it will keep going down the list. All right. Any questions on that? Cool. Functions. So functions are kind of the bread and butter of JavaScript. It's just a block of code that does a certain thing. It's whenever it's called or invoked, that's when it does the code that's inside it. So here we have just a simple, hey, I've got a function of name, and then the code inside to be executed. So here, my function, it just returns the number 25. So you can say, hey, var x equals my function, and then x would then equal 25. So pretty simple. But yeah, that's JavaScript is just, it's built on, it's a function-based language. So variables. So here I tried to focus on, because variables are pretty basic if you've done any kind of coding or any kind of development work. You just need to store information, so you have to put that information in variables. So I kind of try to focus on JavaScript isms for this one, but it can be declared. So some of this stuff has bitten me before. Is a variable can be declared, and in that case, in JavaScript, it's considered undefined, versus the value null. So null and undefined are two very different things in JavaScript, but sometimes they act similar or they'll return the same thing. But null represents the intentional, like it says here, the absence of a value versus if you try to check something's, like let's say I have a passenger manifest and I check for its birth date and no, that's a bad example. I check for its horoscope and it's like, why would it have that? I don't know, but I'm checking for it. It would come back as undefined. Versus a null value would be the food option. Their food preference would come back as null. So here we have the variable name, value, simple to declare, so the var keyword is really powerful in JavaScript, but it can also, because it's not a hard language, a variable can actually change what's actually holding it. So like in the stronger typed languages such as like C++ or C# or Java, you have to say this is an integer or this is a string. Well, in JavaScript, you can take var length equal to 16 and then later on say, well, length equals really long, the string really long, and it would totally be fine. That won't break anything, and it might break your code, but it won't break JavaScript. It's able to handle that just fine. So any questions on that one?
No, we good.
There is also an ism, JavaScript ism with equals versus equals. In JavaScript, you'll often see 3 comparators versus 2. In modes like Java, like the hard other languages, they have just equals this. In JavaScript, like I said, if you do null equals undefined, I believe that comes back false. But if you do null equals undefined, that comes back true.
So triple equals is like compare by type?
That's a good question. I'm trying to remember. Kyler, do you know? I haven't.
No, I've never understood the triple equals, and I've never used it in my code.
Yeah, so in JavaScript, you generally want to use triple in JavaScript, other than when comparing to see if it's null. Because if you check, and that's the other thing too. If a value is 0, it's considered null. If you use triple null, then yeah, it's pretty, like people have written like papers and articles on it. It's pretty crazy, but just and people say it was actually a defect in the original JavaScript. It's just a JavaScript ism, just to be aware of it. And yeah, I personally don't like JavaScript, but
sorry to interrupt you.
No, go ahead.
So I found that triple equals we compare like type and value. Mm-hmm. So type and value has to be the same. Be the same. Yeah.
Versus just double which equal, and that compares value.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Yeah, so it has bitten us in the past. So. Parameters are things that you pass into functions. So they're the again, some JavaScript isms. Arguments. So if you're just passing a number into a parameter, it gets passed by value. Where if you pass in an object, you're actually passing by reference. So if you pass in a passenger object into your function for it to change seats, it's actually pointing back to your original passenger, and if you modify that passenger inside that function, the original passenger will get changed. But if you just pass in his row number and then add that to something and then do whatever, that'll just be passed by value. So that's some stuff on parameters. And then so here it's just simple. Yeah, you can have your function name and then inside the parentheses pass in as many parameters as you want. It's also in JavaScript, you don't have to define what you're passing in to a parameter or into a function, which again, it's like JavaScript's just the Wild West. You can do whatever you want. So you do want to check sometimes in your code if something being passed in is a certain type, like dot type of or compare, yeah, whatever, just to make sure it's not going to break as part of error checking and everything. So here you have your function that takes two parameters, P1 and P2, and returns the value once you multiply them. So here var x equals my function, and then passing in 2 and 5. So x then equals 10. Versus if I pass in P1 and my add another adds a value of dot another. So I'm actually defining a new property of P1 called another, and I'm assigning the digit 3 to it. Then I can actually modify P1. And that would then print 3 once I added. So on down there on var y, I have an empty object. I pass in y into add another, and then I console log y dot another, and it'll print 3. So, and that's just showing that if I pass in an object, it's actually going to modify that object rather than just the value of the object. So, and then finally arrays. So arrays are very common in JavaScript, and they're again very loose, not surprising. An array it can hold more than one value at a time. So a list or an array list is something in other languages that you would use. That's this. So and in JavaScript, it's only done by index number, and they are 0 based. It can never be, that's what an associative array is, something that has a key value pair. I don't know if you guys know about that, the hash, like a hash map or anything like that, where you would pass, instead of giving it a number, you would say, hey, array, give me the value of, let's say you have a phone book array or an address array, and you say, all right, give me your value of city, and it would return Portland. That's how it would work in any other language. In JavaScript, it doesn't do that per se. You can't do that. You can, it pretty much, once you try to make it an associative array, it turns it into an object. So at that point, it kind of acts as a quasi-associative array. So I'm really just going to be focusing on arrays in here. But again, I put the link down there that it's an older article, but it's really good on associative arrays in JavaScript and how they behave and everything. So if you want to look at that, you can. And then the safest way to loop through an array is a for loop. That way you can use either the for in or the for loop and use the length of the array, as long as you're not modifying the array inside the loop. So, yeah, and then there it is again. Just in JavaScript, objects are also associative arrays. So, all right. So here you have your pseudocode with your array, and then it just has several different types of items, and then you can assign new. So in the top one, I'm actually declaring a new array, and in the second one, I'm actually adding another item to the array. And in this case, in the second slot, so it'll be the third item in the array. All right, so here you have your var cars with Saab, Volvo, and BMW. So it's an array that has 3 objects. They're all strings, and you can assign. I'm assigning var x into cars, and from and I'm calling the one in the first slot, which is actually Volvo, because Saab is 0, Volvo is 1, BMW is 3 or 2. I'm sorry. And then I'm saying, hey, cars 3 is now equal to x. So then cars. So I'm actually putting Volvo in the list twice in the third slot, and then in cars 4, I'm putting actually the cars object back in itself. So then it would have another object. It would have itself in the object of the 4th slot, and then you could just put a basic number in cars 5. So that's it representing, I mean, now it has strings, it's got an object, and it's got numbers all in this array, and JavaScript will totally be fine with it. So, and then here you can see the the for loop on how to loop through cars and get all the stuff in a console log. So, all right, and that's it. Are there any questions on that? So that's a lot. Arrays are crazy, and they're even crazier in JavaScript.
That was a great explanation and presentation. Thank you.
All right, cool. I'm going to stop sharing then and stop the broadcast. All right, thanks everybody.